Dave Kowalski had exactly 3 rules for staying alive in deep space. Don't touch anything that glows without gloves. Never sign anything you haven't read twice. And under absolutely no circumstances do you dock at a flagship that isn't yours. He broke all 3 before lunch. It started, as most disasters in Dave's life did, with a fuel coupling that had no business failing at that exact moment. The coupling on Bay 4 of the rusty Helena, his cargo shuttle, his home, his only real possession worth anything, decided to rupture somewhere between the Kellar Drift and the outer shipping lanes of Sector 9. Not a slow leak. Not a warning. A full rupture, the kind that sprayed pressurized coolant across the engine housing and triggered every alarm Dave had ever installed, plus 2 he hadn't known were still active from the previous owner. He had about 40 minutes of stable flight left before the secondary coils overheated, and he became a very small, very brief star. The nearest dock on his charts was a civilian relay station, 200 kilometers off his port side. Standard procedure said file an emergency beacon, coast toward it, wait for a tow. Standard procedure assumed the relay station was still operational. It was not. Someone had decommissioned it 8 months ago and apparently forgotten to update the navigational charts that Dave had bought secondhand from a guy named Paris on Dock 14 of Callaway Station, who Dave was now reconsidering as a reliable source of anything. The second nearest option on his scanner was not a relay station. It was a flagship. The Velshara. Imperial designation, Queen's class, roughly 4 kilometers long, and currently occupying a region of space that Dave had not realized was politically significant until his emergency comms started getting intercepted instead of bounced. The ship was the kind of vessel that made experienced pilots go quiet when they saw it on a scanner. It had the profile of something built not just for travel, but for the specific purpose of making other things feel small. It had weapons arrays that Dave's outdated scanner couldn't even fully catalog. It had the kind of running lights that didn't blink. They just glowed, steady and unbothered, the way things glow when they have nothing to prove. Dave looked at the coolant gauge. He looked at the flagship. He opened a hailing frequency, got a response in 11 seconds, which was frankly faster than any port authority had ever responded to him, and explained the situation in the straightforward, no-nonsense way that had served him across 14 years of independent cargo running. His coupling had blown. His secondary coils were 40 minutes from critical failure. He needed a dock, a replacement part, and maybe a coffee if they had something equivalent. He would be out of their way inside 2 hours. He was not a threat. He was not affiliated with any political body. He was, as he described himself, just a guy with a busted pipe and a tight schedule. There was a pause on the other end that Dave would later understand was not confusion, but the sound of approximately 40 senior officers silently losing their minds at the audacity of a single human in a battered cargo shuttle hailing the Queen's personal flagship and asking for a parking spot. They let him dock anyway. He found out later that the docking officer had approved it simply because no one had ever done it before, and she was curious how it would end. Bay 17 of the Velshara was larger than Dave's entire previous apartment complex back on Meridian Station. The walls were some kind of dark composite material that caught light and scattered it in patterns that looked almost organic, like the inside of something living. The gravity was slightly heavier than Earth standard, not uncomfortable, just the kind of thing you'd notice if you'd been in low grav for 6 weeks, which Dave had. His knees reminded him of this immediately. The air smelled like something between ozone and rain on hot pavement, not unpleasant, actually kind of good. The kind of smell that made your lungs feel like they were working properly for the first time in a while. A port technician met him at the bottom of the ramp. Tall, blue-gray skin, 4 arms, each pair doing something different. The top pair holding a scanning tool, the bottom pair crossed behind her back in a posture Dave would eventually learn was the Velsharan equivalent of professional patience. She looked at him the way a very experienced customs officer looks at someone who has technically not broken any rules, but is clearly the kind of person who might, given time. She scanned his shuttle. She scanned his cargo manifest. She scanned Dave himself, head to toe, twice, with the kind of thoroughness that made him feel like he'd been turned inside out and reassembled, which, as he'd later discover, was not entirely inaccurate as a description of what that scanner actually did. She told him, in accented but clear standard, that his repair would take approximately 90 minutes. That he was to remain in the bay or the adjoining corridor. That he was under no circumstances to access any level above bay deck without an escort. That his cargo would not be touched. That the Velshara was not a civilian vessel, and that his presence here was a temporary exception that would not be repeated. She said all of this in one unbroken sentence without taking a breath, which Dave found impressive. He said, "Sounds good. Any chance of that coffee?" She stared at him for 4 full seconds. She came back 20 minutes later with something warm in a container that was definitely not coffee, but was close enough in the ways that mattered. Hot, slightly bitter. The kind of drink that told your brain it was time to focus. He thanked her. She looked slightly less like she was considering filing a formal complaint. He spent the first hour sitting on a cargo crate, watching the repair crew work on his coupling. They were efficient in a way that made him quietly envious, the kind of efficiency that came not from rushing but from complete certainty about every step. No wasted movement, no double-checking, just hands and tools working in a sequence that was almost musical. He watched one of the younger technicians and tried to figure out which wrench grip they were using on the secondary fitting, and decided that he was, for the first time in a long while, genuinely impressed by someone else's mechanical work. At the 50-minute mark, a different person arrived. Not a technician. The bearing was completely different, not the practical, task-focused movement of the repair crew, but something more deliberate. The kind of walk that meant this person always knew exactly where they were going and had never once in their life been in a hurry, because hurrying implied uncertainty about the destination. 6 arms. Not unusual on this ship, Dave had gathered. Bioluminescent markings along the neck and collarbone area, pale gold, running in patterns that Dave's brain kept trying to read as text, and kept failing. Tall, which seemed to be a consistent feature of everyone on this ship. Eyes that were a very dark amber, almost copper, and which, Dave noticed, went straight to him, and stayed there with the kind of focused attention that made you want to check if you were on fire. White garment, structured, somewhere between a uniform and a robe, with a deep blue stripe across the left shoulder that Dave would learn was the mark of the Queen's healer, the most senior medical officer on the entire vessel. Not a doctor in the human sense, something older than that. More precise. A position that existed at the intersection of medicine and something closer to what humans might call sacred, though the Velsharan had no word that translated to sacred exactly. Only a word that meant the thing which maintains the living, which they considered a more accurate description. Her name was S.Y.T. Vorn. Dave did not know this yet. What Dave knew, in the immediate practical sense, was that she was walking toward him with clear intent, and that the port technician who had been professionally tolerating his presence for the last hour had straightened up in a way that suggested this new arrival significantly outranked her. S.Y.T. Vorn stopped 2 meters from Dave. She looked at him with the focused amber eyes. She looked at the scanner readout in her upper left hand. Then back at him. She said something in Velsharan, and the translation implant Dave had picked up years ago, cheap model, good enough for trade languages, occasionally wrong about tone, rendered it as, "You are the biological anomaly from the cargo vessel." Dave said, "I'm the guy with the busted coupling, yeah." She said, in standard this time, precise and measured, "I need to conduct a health assessment. Standard protocol for all non-registered visitors aboard a Queen-class vessel. It will take approximately 15 minutes. Please follow me to the medical bay." Dave thought about his rule, never sign anything you haven't read twice, and applied it loosely to the concept of medical bays on alien flagships. He thought about the coolant that had definitely gotten on his hands during the initial rupture response. He thought about the fact that he'd been breathing recycled shuttle air for 6 weeks, and his last actual physical check had been 8 months ago on Callaway Station from a medic, who Dave was fairly certain had been hung over. He said, "Yeah, all right." He followed her. The medical bay on the Velshara was not a room. It was a suite of rooms, each with a specific purpose, connected by corridors that were slightly curved in a way that made every transition feel like moving through something organic. The lighting was warm, amber-toned, the kind of light that made everything look like it was very gently glowing, which Dave suspected was intentional and probably had some medical basis. The equipment was completely foreign to him, shapes and configurations that gave no surface-level information about their purpose, which he found unsettling in the specific way that ignorance is unsettling when you're the subject of the procedure rather than a bystander. S.Y.T gestured to a surface that was clearly a medical platform, elevated, smooth, with soft restraints at the sides that were not, she made clear with a look, intended to be used unless requested. Dave sat on the edge of it. The platform was slightly warm. He wasn't sure if that was for comfort or calibration, and decided it didn't matter. She began with the scanner. Long, slow passes, starting at his head and working down. She was not rough, not clinical in the cold sense. There was a quality to her attention that was intensely focused without being impersonal. The way a master craftsman looks at a piece of work they are trying to understand, rather than judge. She made notes between passes, 4 arms working simultaneously, which Dave found difficult not to stare at. Not from any discomfort, but because the coordination was extraordinary. The kind of multitasking that made the human 2-armed experience feel suddenly very limited. She paused at his midsection. Scanned again, made a longer note. He said, "Something wrong?" She said, "Without looking up, your internal microbial ecosystem is extremely dense." He said, "Is that a polite way of saying something?" She looked up then. Brief. A flicker of something that might, in a human face, have been amusement, but her expressions were different enough that Dave wasn't confident reading them yet. She said, "It is a precise way of saying that you are carrying approximately 47 distinct microbial strains that have no catalogued record in the Galactic Medical Database, several of which appear to be producing compounds I have not previously encountered." Dave said, "I eat a lot of fermented stuff. Keeps the digestion regular on long hauls." She looked at him for a moment. She went back to the scanner. She said, "I will need a deeper scan. The standard protocol for undocumented biological material on a Queen-class vessel requires a full-spectrum internal assessment. I will also need a direct tissue sample. The process requires a brief physical contact with the assessment node." She indicated, with her lower right hand, a device attached to a flexible arm on the side of the platform. Smooth, rounded, about the size of a closed fist, giving off a low hum that Dave felt more than heard. "I will place this against your lower abdomen. It will feel like pressure. It will extract a small biological sample without breaking the skin. The whole process takes 4 minutes." Dave said, "The whole process." She said, "The extraction phase takes approximately 90 seconds. The processing phase takes the remaining time." Dave said, "And by extraction you mean?" She said, "The device draws a small quantity of biological fluid through dermal osmosis for analysis. Non-invasive. The term is standard medical terminology." Dave said, "Right. Yeah. Fine. Go ahead." She placed the assessment node against his lower abdomen. The device was warm. The pressure was real, but not uncomfortable. There was a low vibration that moved through him in a way that was entirely clinical, and which his body processed as clinical for exactly as long as he was paying attention to the technical details of it, which was not as long as he would have liked. He stared at the ceiling and thought about the fuel coupling. At the 2-minute mark, S.Y.T said, without looking away from her readout, "You should know that this vessel operates under the Queen's medical charter. All assessments conducted here fall under the bonding protocol. The assessed party's biological information is considered a protected record, shared only between the assessor and the assessed. It is a covenant. In our tradition, the assessor says the binding phrase to confirm the covenant before proceeding to the extraction phase." She paused. "I said it when I began. For the record." Dave said, "What's the binding phrase?" She said it. 4 words in Velshuren. Dave's translation implant rendered it, with the slightly clunky literalism it was prone to, as "I receive you, holy, and without condition. Dave said, "Oh. That's a nice way to put it. Very professional." S.Y.T went very still for exactly 2 seconds. She said, "What did you say?" Dave said, "I said it's a nice, professional thing to say before a medical procedure, like a good bedside manner kind of thing. Makes it feel less," he gestured vaguely, "procedural." S.Y.T said very carefully, "You responded to the binding phrase." Dave said, "I said it was nice." "Yeah." She said, "In Velsharan covenant law, a verbal response to the binding phrase, any verbal response, offered without duress, in the assessor's presence, during the extraction phase, constitutes acceptance of the covenant in full." Dave said, "Okay." She said, "The full covenant." Dave said, "I'm going to need you to define full." The door to the medical bay opened. 3 people entered. 2 of them were clearly guards or officers, bearing, posture, the kind of stillness that meant readiness. The third was a woman who was taller than anyone else Dave had encountered on the ship, who wore something that was less a garment and more a statement, and whose presence changed the quality of the air in the room in a way Dave couldn't quantify but could absolutely feel. The amber lights seemed to orient toward her, not literally, but nearly. The translation implant, which had been working adequately all day, chose this moment to provide Dave with a word it had never needed to produce before. Queen. The Queen of the Velsharan Empire looked at S.Y.T. Then, she looked at Dave. Then she looked at S.Y.T again, and in her expression was something that Dave, who had become reasonably good at reading faces across species lines over 14 years of trade work, recognized with growing unease as amusement. She said one word in Velsharan. The translation implant said, "Congratulations." Dave said, "Congratulations for what?" Nobody answered him immediately. S.Y.T was doing something with her 4 hands that involved the scanner, the assessment readout, and what looked like an official record interface, all simultaneously, with the focused intensity of someone who is doing something correctly and is extremely unhappy about it. The Queen said, in perfect standard, with the diction of someone who had learned the language academically and spoke it with more precision than most native speakers, "You have just completed a full medical bonding covenant with my healer under the Velsharan Royal Charter. As of approximately 90 seconds ago, you are, in the eyes of every governing body that recognizes the Charter, which is to say, all of them, her bonded partner." Dave said, What?" The Queen said, "Bonded. The word has a specific legal and biological meaning in our culture. I assume your translator has provided you with the closest equivalent." The implant, on cue, offered the word again. "Married." Dave sat on the edge of the medical platform, slightly warm, with an assessment node still resting against his abdomen, and said, with the particular flatness of a man whose brain has simply refused to process the current input at full speed, "I just wanted to fix my coupling." The Queen looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Yes, I imagine you did." She turned to leave. At the door she paused. She did not turn back. She said, still in perfect standard, with a quality in her voice that Dave would spend a long time trying to name before settling on ancient and entertained in equal measure, "Welcome aboard the Velshara consort. I hope your coupling holds." She left. Dave looked at S.Y.T. S.Y.T looked at her scanner. Dave said, "Is she?" S.Y.T said, "Yes." Dave said, "And we're?" S.Y.T said, "Legally." "Yes." Dave said, "Across how many jurisdictions?" S.Y.T said, 17. A pause. "Currently." Dave said, "Currently." S.Y.T said, "The number typically stabilizes within 48 hours as the charter propagates through the diplomatic registry." Dave said, "Typically." S.Y.T said nothing. She was still looking at her scanner. Her bioluminescent markings, Dave noticed, had shifted from pale gold to something closer to deep orange. He did not yet know enough about Velsharan physiology to know what that meant. He would learn, in time, that it meant flustered in a way that the Velsharan language had 17 words for and still considered inadequate. Dave looked at the ceiling. He thought about his rule. Never sign anything you haven't read twice. He thought about how I said it was nice was technically not a signature. Not a signature at all. Not even close to a signature. And yet here he was. Apparently married across 17 jurisdictions to the Queen's healer on a flagship the size of a small city because his fuel coupling had blown at the worst possible moment in the worst possible sector of space. He thought about how Paris on Dock 14 had sold him outdated charts. He was going to have words with Paris. He said, "Does this come with any benefits? Health coverage? Dental?" S.Y.T turned to look at him fully for the first time since the Queen had left. The amber eyes, the golden-orange glow along her neck. The expression that was doing something complicated that Dave's face-reading skills, developed across 14 years and dozens of species, were having genuine difficulty categorizing. She said, "You are bonded to the Queen's healer. I am, by definition and profession, the most qualified medical practitioner in this empire." Dave said, "So that's a yes on the health coverage." She looked at him for 3 more seconds. She said, "Your microbial ecosystem is still being processed. The results will be ready in 6 minutes. I suggest you remain seated." She turned back to her equipment. Dave remained seated. Outside, through the bay's small viewport, the stars held their positions, indifferent and ancient and completely uninvested in the fact that a cargo mechanic from Meridian Station had just become the most accidentally significant human being in the known galaxy. For reasons that had nothing to do with courage or destiny, and everything to do with a busted pipe, a second-hand chart, and a very poor understanding of alien covenant law. The assessment node finished its cycle. It beeped once, softly, and went dark. Somewhere in its processed results was the beginning of the end of a 300-year plague. Dave didn't know that yet either. He asked S.Y.T if there was any more of that coffee. She did not respond for a moment. Then she went and got him some. Dave had a system for processing unexpected information. He developed it over 14 years of cargo running, across situations that ranged from minor, discovering his cargo manifest had been switched with someone else's at a border checkpoint, to significant, finding out mid-flight that the agricultural equipment he'd been contracted to deliver was not, in any meaningful sense, agricultural. The system was simple. You took the information. You set it aside in a mental compartment that you labeled "not right now." You focused on the immediate practical problem. You came back to the larger thing when the immediate thing was handled. The immediate thing was that his coupling repair still had 30 minutes left. He focused on that. He sat on the medical platform and drank the not coffee and watched S.Y.T work through the assessment results with the focused efficiency of someone who was absolutely, completely, entirely focused on the task at hand and was not thinking about anything else, which Dave could tell was a deliberate performance because her bioluminescent markings had gone through 3 distinct color shifts in the last 12 minutes, and she kept doing a thing with her upper left hand where she'd reach for an instrument and then not pick it up, and then reach for it again. He knew that gesture. He made that gesture. It was the gesture of someone who had a question they hadn't decided yet whether to ask. He let her not ask it. He'd been in enough uncomfortable situations to know that pushing someone toward a conversation they weren't ready for was a reliable way to make the conversation worse when it eventually happened. He drank his not coffee. He watched the assessment readout display things in Velsharan's script that he couldn't read, and occasionally display numbers that spiked in ways that seemed to mean something significant, because every time one of them spiked, S.Y.T would go very still for a second before resuming her work. At the 8-minute mark, she said, without turning around, "How long have you been consuming fermented food products?" Dave said, "Since I was a kid. My grandmother made everything fermented. Pickled vegetables, fermented grain drinks, preserved proteins. She said it was the only way to eat if you wanted to stay healthy. Old Earth tradition. Regional thing." S.Y.T said, "And you have maintained this diet throughout your adult life." Dave said, "On long hauls there's not much else. Fermented stuff keeps." Doesn't need refrigeration if it's done right. I make a batch at the start of every run. S.Y.T said, you make it yourself. Dave said, learned from my grandmother. Why? She didn't answer immediately. She pulled up a secondary display, overlaid it on the first, stared at the combination for a long moment. She said, the compound your microbial ecosystem is producing, specifically, the interaction between 3 of the undocumented strains, is generating a byproduct that I have been searching for in documented medical literature for 6 years. A compound theorized but never isolated. Never observed in a living system. She paused. It is present in your biological material in significant concentration. Dave said, is that good or bad? She said, it depends entirely on what you consider significant. He said, I'm going to need a less medical answer than that. She turned around. The amber eyes were doing something focused and intense in a way that was different from the focused intensity of the medical assessment. This was not clinical. This was the look of someone standing at the edge of something very large trying to measure its dimensions. She said, there is a parasite, the S.Y.T strain. It has been endemic across 11 star systems for 312 years. It integrates with host neural tissue. It cannot be removed once established without destroying the tissue it has integrated with. It has no known treatment, no known cure, no organism or compound that has demonstrated reliable neutralizing activity against it in a living host. Dave said. Okay, she said. Your byproduct demonstrates neutralizing activity against it. In the sample I just processed. In 6 minutes of incubation, the S.Y.T cells in the test matrix I ran it against are gone. Not suppressed. Gone. Dave said, gone. She said, gone. Dave looked at his not coffee. He thought about his grandmother's kitchen, which had smelled permanently of vinegar and something earthy, and about the rows of ceramic pots she kept on shelves that ran from floor to ceiling, and about how she'd handed him a small jar of starter culture when he'd left for the shipping lanes at 19 and told him to keep it alive because it would keep him alive, which he'd taken as the general philosophy of an old woman and not as a precise medical prediction about an alien plague 300 years in the making. He said, so my gut bacteria cures a 300-year plague. She said, the compound your gut bacteria produces, yes. In preliminary analysis. He said, because of the fermented food. She said, the fermentation process appears to create the specific conditions under which the 3 relevant strains interact to produce the compound. Without the fermentation, the strains would likely coexist without producing anything significant. He said, my grandmother's recipe cures a 300-year plague. S.Y.T said, preliminarily. This requires extensive further analysis, controlled trials, replication across multiple samples, Dave said. But you think so? She looked at him for a moment. She said, yes. He processed this. He applied his system. He labeled it not right now and tried to set it in the compartment with the marriage information, which was already quite full, and found that the compartment was not large enough for both pieces of information simultaneously, and that they kept pressing against each other in ways that made his thinking feel slightly unstable. He said, what does this mean practically? For today. Right now. Practically. She said, it means I need a larger sample. It means I need to document everything, your diet, the specific strains, the fermentation process, the conditions. It means I need to run this through the Queen's medical authority before any formal claim is made. She paused. It also means that your departure in, she checked something, 18 minutes as currently scheduled, is not possible. He said, how long are we talking? She said, to conduct a proper preliminary study with the minimum documentation required to present to the Queen's Medical Council. A week, possibly 2. Dave thought about his cargo. Perishable goods, moderately, not critically. He thought about his delivery contract, which had a penalty clause that kicked in at 10 days late and a force majeure exception that he was fairly certain covered being detained on an alien flagship for medical research, though he'd never tested that interpretation in court. He thought about his shuttle sitting in Bay 17, coupling freshly repaired, ready to go, and himself not going. He said, "I'm going to need a room." She said, "You will be assigned quarters." "As the bonded partner of the Queen's healer, you are entitled to," he said. "You don't have to keep saying that." She stopped. The orange glow along her neck deepened slightly. She said, "It is the accurate description of your current legal status." He said, "I know. Every time you say it, I have to not think about it, and I'm running out of compartments." She looked at him with an expression he still couldn't fully read. She said, "Compartments." He said, "I have a system for processing things. When there's too much at once, I put the big stuff in compartments in my head and deal with the immediate thing first. But I'm at capacity right now. So if you could just," he gestured vaguely, "call me Dave for the moment, and we can come back to the accurate descriptions later." She was quiet for a moment. The amber eyes. The shifting glow. Then she said, "The quarters will be comfortable. We will begin the study tomorrow morning. I will arrange for food provisions that align with your dietary practices. You will need to continue consuming your fermented products throughout the study period to maintain the microbial consistency." He said, "I have supplies on the shuttle. Enough for a couple weeks if I'm careful." She said, "I will arrange access." He said, "Thank you." She turned back to her equipment. He said, "Zalith." She paused but didn't turn around. He said, I'm not going to make this weird. The other thing, I'm going to focus on the study and getting this information to whoever needs it, and then we'll figure out the rest, if that works." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, quietly, in a way that was precise in the manner of someone who's being very careful about every word, "It works." He nodded to himself. He finished the not coffee. He thought about his grandmother, who had died when he was 23, who had pressed that jar of starter culture into his hands at the departure gate and said, "Keep it alive," and who had been, as far as Dave could determine from this vantage point many years later, and several light years from her kitchen, either extraordinarily prescient or the luckiest woman who had ever lived. He thought she'd have found this whole situation extremely funny. He decided to take the thought out of the compartment labeled "not right now" and just let it sit in the open for a moment, let it breathe. The whole impossible weight of it, the coupling failure, the wrong flagship, the covenant phrase he hadn't understood, the marriage across 17 jurisdictions, the 300-year plague, the jar of starter culture on a shelf in Bay 17, and what he found when he held it all at once and didn't try to manage it was that it was enormous and absurd, and he didn't know what any of it meant yet, but that sitting here in an amber-lit medical bay on a flagship the size of a city with a 6-armed alien healer who was very carefully not looking at him was, at minimum, more interesting than where he'd expected. He set down the empty cup. He said, "What time do we start tomorrow?" Zalith said, "6th hour. Ship time." He said, "What's the 6th hour?" She said, "Early." He said, "Fantastic." He stood up from the platform. His knees registered the gravity again. He stretched, and something in his lower back made a sound that he'd been ignoring for 3 weeks, and Zalith turned at the sound with an expression that was so immediately automatically professional, the healer's reflex, the instinct toward assessment, that he almost laughed. He said, "It's fine. Old injury. I've had it looked at." She said, "By whom?" He said, "A medic on Callaway Station." She said, with the weight of someone who had already formed a detailed opinion about the medical standards of Callaway Station based on her assessment of its most recent patient, "I will look at it tomorrow." He said, "You don't have to." She said, "You are my bonded partner. Your health is my professional and legal responsibility." He paused. She paused. The words sat between them in the amber light. He said, "You said you weren't going to keep." She said, "That was you who said that." He said, "Right." She said, "I made no such agreement." He looked at her. She looked at him. Something flickered in the amber eyes that was not quite amusement but lived in that neighborhood, in a district just adjacent to it. He said, "Good night, Zalith." She said, "Good night." A pause. Very brief. Then, Dave. He walked out of the medical bay and followed the corridor toward the quarters deck, past equipment he couldn't name and viewports that showed a depth of stars he'd never quite get used to. And he thought that whatever tomorrow held, The study, the analysis, the Queen, the 17 jurisdictions. All of it. At least the coupling was fixed. Small mercies. He found his quarters. They were, as promised, comfortable. More comfortable than anything he'd slept in since he couldn't remember when. Larger than his entire shuttle cabin, with a viewport that looked out into clean, deep space. He lay down on a surface that adjusted to him in a way that suggested it had assessed his physical dimensions and structural needs, which under the circumstances he decided not to think about too hard. He looked at the stars. He thought, "Grandmother, you are not going to believe this." He fell asleep faster than he expected, in the warm gravity of a ship that was not his, that was now in some legal and biological and entirely accidental sense partly his. And outside the stars held their ancient positions, and the Velshara moved through them with the quiet certainty of something that had been moving through difficult space for a very long time, and intended to keep moving for a very long time more. In the medical bay, 3 decks down, Zaelith stood in front of her assessment readout and looked at the results of the most significant medical discovery in 3 centuries. She looked at them for a long time. Then, she looked at the doorway through which Dave had left. The bioluminescent markings along her neck were, if anyone had been there to observe them, the precise deep amber of someone who has encountered something completely unexpected and is beginning, only beginning, to consider the possibility that unexpected is not the same as unwelcome. She turned off the main lights. She kept working.